Welcome to Modern Anarchy, the podcast featuring real conversations with conscious objectors to the status quo. I'm your host, Nicole.
I tried to keep her quiet, but she's screaming outside of me. I tried to keep her hiding, oh, shut up. I tried to keep her quiet, but she's a wild, wild woman.
Hello, anarchist community. On today's episode, we have artist and podcaster Dxtr Spits join us for a conversation all about the power of vulnerability. Together, we talk about the social conditioning of men, working through trauma, and our fears about monogamous marriages. Dxtr, I really appreciate how you came into the space and just fully opened yourself up to talk about all of the complexities and difficulties that you faced in your early childhood and how you are still working to unpack these larger cycles that you still recognize in yourself. And that is some of the most difficult work we can ever do as humans. And it really just inspired me to dream of a better future, right? Where we're all doing this work and able to unpack and show up as our highest selves, or whatever we want to call it, right? The self that you hope to be in this world. And Dxtr is so clearly working towards that vision of being the person that he wants to be. And I just really appreciate, the fullness of your presence, Dxtr. I also, really was thinking about our conversation about marriage and the concept of polyamory and how our fears of a monogamous marriage kind of pushing us into wanting to pursue an open relationship and trying to sit with that. And what does that mean? How do we approach these things with desire and a trust in the abundance rather than coming at it from a fear mentality that I equally do myself? I do not have any of the answers to these questions. They're just good questions, at least currently. And so it was just nice to sit with Dxtr, someone who has these same points of, this scares me, and this is where I'm at. And so, y'all, there is nothing more real than that. I hope you all enjoy getting to tune in to our shared vulnerability together. Do you need anything? Like, do you need water, tea, or anything? I've got tea. I'm ready for this.
Emotional support.
Ooh, as a future psychologist, that is exactly what I'm here for.
All right, bring it on.
Well, what do you need emotional support in?
Oh, that's how much time you got. That's like a long existential question.
These are my favorite. Like, these are my absolute favorite. And I wonder if that's why you were nominated. Someone's like, these two people are going to have a beautiful conversation about all of this.
Yeah, if from anything with Jayla, she knows we talk about this stuff all of the time. So it's pretty... That's standard protocol around these parts.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Tell me about it.
Well, I mean, the generals or the specifics. I'll say in general, I think the life of many artists or creatives or anybody who just kind of questions the regular, normal, whatever we're presented about how life should go. I think it leaves you sometimes in a place of consistent uncertainty because you're the grounding thing for yourself a lot of the time. So that's where most of mine usually lies, is in that kind of space.
Kind of that like solo journey?
Yeah, that's been a lot of my life, whether how I've selected to go or just how it's panned out in a lot of ways. As a good friend of mine who actually just texted me right before this said, he's like, yeah, you've picked a lot of lonely roads, man. So yeah.
Which road comes most to mind when you think about those lonely roads?
I mean, shameless plug, but also it is the work that I'm doing right now. I'm working on, I guess you could say, movement called How Men Cry that's centered around talking about mental health, men's mental health, specifically in vulnerability. And in that space, I'm performing pieces, writing pieces, as well as on a more like business side of things, like trying to build it out as doing more performance and all types of spaces and then coordinating stuff with podcast guests as well, and speaking with a lot of men within community. So it's a community driven project, but I think there is a reality that, if I stop working or stop moving on the thing or stop performing, then nothing else moves really. So there's an isolation in that. Yeah.
Certainly. I mean, this sounds like it's a very meaningful project to you. And I would be curious, how did you start this? What, no one just starts this out of the blue, and I want to hear you. Like, what brought you to creating this?
Yeah, it was really just beginning to recognize and face a lot of my own personal issues and traumas. I think the way that I was mostly socialized growing up, especially around conventional male narratives and just the environments that I grew up in, I didn't really start talking about, two-part is recognizing how I was feeling in a more quieter space and being able to name it a little better. And then secondly, being able to actually acknowledge and process and deal with those feelings in a way that wasn't just trying to escape, So that all was through a process of therapy. And then, I mean, to be real, I've gone through enough in my life, quite a few things that, some would consider pretty traumatizing. And it was just stuff that I hadn't, addressed ever.
Yeah.
So,
certainly.
So that was kind of the sparking point, was going through my own process of therapy, which I'm still in and doing. And, writing, because that's a lot of how I found comfort through life. So those writings eventually turned into a book and into a bunch of stuff.
Wow. And so it sounds like from your early childhood, there might have been models that weren't, displaying how to be vulnerable as a man.
Oh, totally. Yeah. I mean, how much do you want me to go into that? I got plenty
of everything, or as much as you feel like resonates with you.
Yeah. I mean, so I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area originally. That's where I'm from. Been in Chicago since about 2014. And then also, I guess you can say, time period wise, there were not really a lot of conversations around how we're having talks now around kind of breaking down what we've learned about, being masculine or other things like that. It just wasn't really part of it. It was a very more black and white kind of outlook, at least for the most part, around this is how men are, this is how women are, blah, blah, blah. That was just and it has been quite disorienting, if I'm being really honest, to try to figure out who I am without a lot of those influences, because and this is really what a lot of the work that I'm working on now is doing. I think for men, it's really difficult because of how aggressively indoctrinated you are. And actually the same buddy before, Brizzy Danks, I'm just going to shout out Brizzy Danks. He's a good producer friend and buddy for some years now. And he kind of said to me, he's like, have you ever just noticed just how violent all this stuff is towards anything with guys? Everything is always introduced to you almost in a way of violence, or it's like this, or it's like that, or you're not competing enough, or you're blah blah blah, and you're not valuable if you're this. So it's it's extremely intense, and it's been really difficult, honestly, to to break that stuff down. And then it's how you're raised, so then you're constantly damn, I was doing that too, and it's just
right.
So.
Right. And then do you judge yourself for reenacting those same patterns, but knowing it was the environment, and then constantly that whole mind loop as well,
Oh yeah, that one's difficult. And that's why really what I've been trying to shed light on for a lot of men is that when you couple that with the fact that, we also are not really taught or instructed on how to speak about what's going on, you end up in this situation of you bottle in, and then you're agitated and you're trying to figure it out, and then you don't know how to talk to anybody about it and going back and forth. So I think, there's a reason that I think suicide numbers for men are so much higher, 3 or 4 times within, I think I might be misquoting the stat, but within like the early 20s to 30s, it's like one of the leading causes of death, like the second leading cause of death, I think, for men within that category. I might be misquoting that, but it's pretty regardless.
It's a problem.
Yeah. So, but that's been really apparent to me because of how, the more and more self-aware you become about it and the more and more you try to address it, it's like it can be quite overwhelming. And I think it's hard for guys to articulate that.
Of course. Right. On top of that, we're talking about societal gender expectations that have been imbued, certain models of what it means to be a man. That's years of cultural conditioning to come up against. So yeah, that is a huge battle.
Yeah. And even, I think, culturally as well, like, there's racial layers to it as well, because even I grew up in primarily Black areas, and depending on, I don't want to demonize or overstate anything for certain groups, but there's, I would just say, a lot of strong opinions, like, sometimes towards people being queer, and like, and just like, there's a lot of cultural things that are perpetuated sometimes. The more and more that my friend groups and everything have diversified, and I just know more people and exchange and have these different outlooks, I see that even across it, like, so many of the men have had this like similar indoctrination and have almost like a lot of times end up separating themselves entirely from groups. Like it's almost like the more self-aware, the harder it is. Like I've kind of been this way for a while, but I don't have like a group of like the guys that we all get together and hang. Like I don't even have that. So
the word indoctrination. This is something that like I personally have no experience with as, a woman in this world, and all the other aspects of the different identities that are integrated into this. Could you say a little bit more on what you feel that indoctrination is that you were under at that time and you see in other people?
Yeah, I mean, for sure, it is the idea, probably one of the biggest ones that I think is the hardest to see, is the idea that your value is tied to what you produce. That one is one of the trickiest ones, I think, for guys in particular to see, because it's what is drilled like all of the time. You got to go have this job. You need to blah, blah, blah.
Provider.
No woman's ever going to want you if you don't do blah, 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 blah. And you need to be the next so-and-so, the next big figure in this space. You need to dominate in the workplace. You need to, like, all of that stuff. And it's so, that has been a really tricky one for me in particular, because I fell for it for a considerable amount of time in my life. And it's hard to, like, even today, I just had a day where I was just kind of off and didn't really want to be productive. But the narrative in my mind is like, you're wasting your life. You're not doing this. You're not. It's just crazy. It's crazy.
Yes, completely. I mean, I obviously not man, but I feel these same things. I can't even imagine what it would be like to have the social conditioning of male patriarchy that says the men need to be the providers, and if they're not the providers, they're worthless, right? And so then plus capitalism. So I, as a woman, I'm getting capitalism, but you're getting capitalism plus must be provider plus must have no emotion, and all these other like slew of things on top of it. Oh.
Yeah, and by the way, like, I definitely think it's worth mentioning that I don't view it as any better or worse for any particular groups of dealing with it. I think it's just different, and that's what I'm more so trying to articulate. Because I can like clearly see a lot of the struggles or just issues with different conversations around gender or like race, all of these different things, and it's like, what I'm aiming to do with that work is just kind of shed some different light on it, because the voices are back to the like full circle of the kind of like lonely road part. It's happening now where there's more and more conversations, but I think even some of the conversations can be so polarizing because of like there's a very versus mentality within I think the US, and some of it I think is a bit of human nature, but I just mean like we're very like this versus this, where I'm really not trying to get into a versus discussion. I'm trying to get into a this is what's going on with people, and let's just, you know, try to figure out how to deal with it.
Yeah. I wonder if that versus sense is coming from the difference in gender. Like from me talking about it, is that what you're feeling, me like pull that divide? It's
not even just all gender. It's like politicized. It's political. It's people's. Yeah. It's this idea of like, well, so the tagline for How Men Cry is to make compassion contagious.
I love that.
Yeah, and the idea around that is like, I just blame the internet, but
that's fine. I'm with you. I blame the internet always.
It's so like angry, and I get it. Like I understand, you know, like I totally get why. I understand why there are a whole bunch of different individuals who can be justifiably pissed about plenty of shit, but I think it's just am I supposed to curse? I don't even know.
My God, curse up, right, left. You can fuck around as much as you want with your language. Go for it, my friend.
But that's like, I think what gets lost in that sometimes is like how to say, okay, this is somebody's individual struggle, and that's actually something I've had to learn more and more of because it also was not something that I was necessarily shown a lot of in a really healthy way coming up, so it gets easier to see. And for like guys' stories and stuff, I mean, I'm hearing a lot of really intense stories. I mean, a lot of guys really, really open up about things. Yeah. And you know, it's allowed me to just kind of take a step back and see them differently.
Of course, completely. A whole different reconceptualization. And I mean, that is so much weight to hold. I just want to say, you know, like to hear these stories, I'm sure it's a lot that you personally take as well, because I mean, compassion has a weight to it.
Yeah, I would agree. And that's something that I've been working on a day-to-day basis, is like trying to keep a healthy balance with that. And a few of the guys, you know, will say, they'll be like, oh, you know, like, how are you doing after a conversation? And it's been different. Like I've released a lot of work and a lot of art and stuff before, but this project or this work in particular is definitely more. It's just a stronger. It is a slightly heavier emotional weight because of the pieces that I'm performing are all from like life experience and personal. And then, yes, the stories. And the more and more guys that see that I do it, as soon as they come in contact with me, the first thought or statement is like, hey, man, they just unload.
Just unload everything.
Which is great in the overall conversation. But
right. But that's still a lot for you. And then it's like, how do you weigh that desire to help and be compassionate towards others, but keep a boundary of, you know, like, this is as much emotional weight I can hold today, and I need maybe for you not to have dumped that on me just on the spot. You know, that's such a hard tug.
Yeah. And it's tricky though, because of how sometimes not provided those spaces are usually for the guys. I'm like, man, just go on ahead, because
exactly. Yeah, because where else are they gonna go?
Yeah. So I'm like, just go ahead, man, you know, a lot of the times. So.
And that's very kind of you. Yeah, I feel like therapy is not, I mean, I shouldn't speak for it. I guess so here's my thing. I'm getting nervous that like, oh, I'm a woman, I shouldn't speak for the male experience. So I keep wanting to connect with you and be like, yeah, I feel the same way. But then recognizing like, these pieces, they're such a unique experience for you that I want to hear more of your story, because I shouldn't be speaking as much on these things at all. But I'm with you and I'm empathizing with you in all of this.
Well, I'm down. So part of what I was saying earlier, too, of even like the not versus thing is, I think there are a lot of points that are relatable, because we are, and that's what's tricky about the conversations
Yeah.
is that, like, the deeper undertone is like every individual or human being is dealing with, you know, potentially issues with trauma. They're dealing with,
Yes.
there's a range of
Yes.
human emotion that we're all
Yep.
dealing with. It's not,
Yep.
it isn't isolated.
Yeah.
And, you know, so I personally don't mind as much. I also understand, and I get, you know, you're saying you're not trying to overly compare to it, but they're, in a way, that's part of what the hope is with a lot of the men's work, is I'm like, everybody's tried to convince you your whole life that you aren't feeling this range of emotion. It's like, but actually you just are. And because we're pretending that we aren't,
yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
So.
No, I get that. Yes. No, I agree. And so, like, maybe it's not so much of a gendered thing as much as it's just a human thing.
That's the eventual overall hope, but it's like baby steps.
Oh yeah. No. Yeah, we can't sell the vision yet. We are just starting the journey. Could you tell me more? I'm trying to conceptualize you as a child, like where you were at in your family dynamics and what sort of things were you seeing modeled before you?
Yeah. So I actually, if you include my stepsisters, I have like 8 sisters, which is like a whole
Huge,
thing.
Yeah.
I grew up with mostly 4 of them. I kind of have a 5th sister that was in and out a bit. And then my mother and father. Now, the way initially as a younger kid, there were a lot more male influences with a lot of my like uncles, and our family unit was a bit more tight knit. So in terms of most of the imagery that I had for men, it was my father was like a main, you know, influence. And then these kind of bordering uncles and my grandfather actually probably being one of the most stable male role models I'd had. Just unfortunately, from time and issues with substance and mental health issues and other things, a lot of those male figures, you know, kind of just ran into a lot of life difficulties, to say it as simply as possible, where most of those situations didn't necessarily turn out as ones that I would want to like model myself after in some ways. And I don't want to be overly critical as people doing the best that they could at the time, but just a lot of things with substance and you know, it really wasn't the best model. So
yeah, and I think it's very fair. I mean, I want to honor the fact that you're trying not to be critical, but you can also acknowledge that you weren't, you know, you didn't receive the love that you deserved at that time.
Yeah, and that's and I would say my perception about that changes on a like daily basis as part of my personal work that I'm trying to do. And a lot of it comes out in the How Men Cry book itself. Like I've been rewriting a lot of what was there originally. So
yeah, could you say more? I'd be curious to hear more about that evolution of how you look back on that time and make meaning of that.
Yeah, I think what is tricky to do is to, and especially going through a process of therapy, is you're going back to directly, you know, revisit that timeline, that childhood timeline, you know. And what I've realized with me is there have been so much suppressed for so long, and so much kind of build up of things. Like when I say things out loud or like to people in passing, it'll be like, oh, you went through that? They're like, yo, that's crazy.
Yeah.
And
wow.
For instance, not to one of the poems out of the book, because the book has basically been a culmination of like these different reflections. And one of the pieces I just released, it's a sadder tone piece for sure. It was inspired from seeing like a young man get shot in front of me, basically. And my friend who, you know, just DM'd, they were like, yo, I had heard this piece before. They were like, but I never knew this backstory, and this is a real situation. And my reply, and I'm not at all trying to make light of the situation, but my reply was like, yeah, it was pretty crazy, LOL. But then I like took a step back later where I was like, that's a traumatic circumstance. And then I'm just like, haha, yeah, it's cool. But that's what's been like the response, I think, a lot of the times is this like, oh yeah, and then, you know, you just, so I've been like really trying to unpack a lot personally and not downplay things that have, you know, been traumatic or brought up a lot of difficult emotion.
Yeah, and I mean, that's not easy work to do. I mean, yeah, naturally we're always trying to protect ourselves. And so when we think about those memories, it's so much easier to just come off with humor and be like, oh yeah, funny, it doesn't bother me. And like, to some degree, humor is such a healthy coping mechanism. But like you're saying, yeah, it's not healthy if you're not going back to do that work of actually process, wow, like how did this experience actually shape me? So I want to admire and, you know, honor the fact in you that you're doing that work, and not everyone does that work, and that it's difficult as hell.
It really is. And I think, I mean, honestly, that's been basically the past 2 or 3 years have probably been the most emotionally uncomfortable. Oof. Like 2 or 3. Like it's been for a minute. Ever since I've been in therapy, it's been pretty bad because... Not to discourage anybody.
No, but it's hard. That's super okay to say. Like, it's hard, difficult work.
But no, I mean, it has been, like, just to be really transparent, because it's like working on letting it go. And this is no slight to anyone, but I've like never been on any type of medication for anything, or like any other like support in that type of way, and probably, I mean, really easily, arguably so, at different points in time, there was definitely more attention that I needed on my mental health space. So it's been lately, what I've been doing is just trying to slow myself down a lot more, to just recognize like, oh, actually, I am extremely emotionally drained, you know, right now, or a bunch of stuff is coming up and I'm not in a good mental space, and trying to like baby step it.
Yeah, certainly. Having that connection back to yourself, to like take a moment to breathe, and instead of just responding immediately, you choose how you respond rather than react.
Yeah, totally. Way easier said than done.
Oh, yes, yes. I mean, but the thing is, I don't know what other life to live. Do you know what I mean? Like, the other life to live, at least for me personally, with my experience, was reacting constantly, not necessarily even knowing why I was reacting the way I did, and like it sprays out on the other relationships that you have. So it's not only like you're suffering internally, it's also how you treat other people. I can't imagine not doing this sort of work personally.
Yeah, I mean, I'm honestly just glad that I've been able to find it to that point exactly. I mean, I've made a lot of mistakes and hurt a lot of people in that space, you know, like the space of not processing or not dealing with it. Just to be real, like and the more and more that I see things now, like I think we're very quick sometimes to judge people's situation of, well, they're being like this, they're being like that. To give an example, like men that I've talked to on the podcast, and even myself, is like, you're dealing with people with, you know, severe early abuse in childhood. Sometimes you're dealing with people who've, you know, have had death right in front of their face, like literally have had, you know, all type, like, it just, the amount of like the amount of difficulty that sometimes people are carrying around. And I'm not excusing that it comes out in like shitty ways, but just like the more and more I see a lot of this stuff, the more it's like, man, half of the time the way people are acting in the world, it really doesn't have anything to do with you. It's like they're in it, you know?
Yep. So. Yep. And that is something I share with you equally, this same sense of hurt people. Yeah. And I always try to come back to that when someone hurts me or something, you know, I see other people hurting other people. I try to come back to, where is their trauma at? You know, there's something there that has taught them this is the safest way to interact in this world. And then that cycle has been perpetuated. And so they are doing their best, trying to stay safe with what they've been taught and what the world has shown them.
Yeah.
And the world is vastly unfair to many people.
Yeah. No, that's a great way to put it. And I definitely agree and have seen a lot of that in general. It's like, even down to now, through a lens of like relationships and just trying to communicate in ways that are more healthy.
Tell me.
It's, it's like, oh, a lot of what I've witnessed or seen is combativeness, cutting people off, shutting people down, yelling at people. This, and then it's like, oh, and then you're supposed to go into the world and be this model communicator that knows how to hear somebody out properly and respond with patience and love. It's like, and actually I talked with Nexus about this. There's no education about this.
There's not.
A lot of
at
the
all.
time.
Isn't that crazy?
It doesn't make any sense. It's like, so then when I see, and even myself in relationship, it's been one of, the hardest things for me, to be honest, is like trying to figure out how to be in close relationship is really difficult for me. And I don't think that because of the internet or the perception of how I deliver art or work, there's an idea that, oh, you're like relatable, you're this and that. It's like, that's from an internet post, but it's like, try to be the person in relationship dealing with the childhood trauma version.
Yeah.
It's not that easy.
Yeah.
So...
Do you feel like this is pervasive in all of your relationships, or mostly in romantic or sexual?
I would say all of the above, I think, because actually a good friend of mine put it in a way where they said they look at relationships with a lowercase r. They were saying, because we have this idea of like, this person, if this is your partner, this is this major relationship, and this and that. It's like, you're always in relationship with people.
Thank you. Yes.
So, so I would say I see it in business. I see it in and a lot of the times it's kind of ironic, because I would say it seems like those things are not present, and you can you can have these wonderful things, like how I show up into work has nothing to do with my personal self. How I show up with my friends has nothing to do with my personal self in this way. We try to categorize it, but it's really not quite. It's not true.
You cannot do that. That's not possible.
It isn't true. Yeah.
I don't believe that's possible. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like who you are. So I actually had to say something to people that work on the How Men Cry project, where I literally was just like, hey, look, I have issues with being abandoned. I have issues with like feeling left and other stuff like that. It's like, so I have trust issues around who is working in or on projects with me. It's just, it's that, I can say it a lot more straightforward now, but it's like, so I'm like letting that be known, even in ways of like, yo, if you feel like I'm tripping or if I'm into control mode or something, it's like, there's a reality, and this stuff is emotional as fuck. Like, just to be real, this project in general just brings up a lot. And my Audrey, who's the creative director and works on it a lot, she's always like, just go to the woods for a couple of days. She's like, go
I'm fine with that though. I do.
She's like, go take a nap, eat a sandwich. I'm like, all right.
Yeah. No, I mean, those things are so important though, like time, breaks, food, all those sorts of things play into like how we take care of ourselves. So yes, I think all of that makes so much sense. Yeah. And I'm just, I'm so enamored by your ability to show up fully in that space and, be able to present, this is what I struggle with, and I'm naming it bravely and with the strength to know that that does not define me.
Yeah. I mean, and it's been difficult. I think it's more so gotten to a point where I'm just like, it doesn't really work the other way around anyway.
Thank you. Yeah.
you know?
I agree.
And to your point of just like romantic relationships, like sex, anything like that, it's for me, I didn't really see a lot of. So my grandparents and one set of uncle and aunt out of, I think, let's just say ballpark about 10 to 12 of the relationships that I grew up with, all of them ended in divorce, other than my like grandparents and like one set of aunt and uncle. And it's not to say that people weren't able to find new relationships or do this or do that. But what I saw kind of like in a domino effect was just like one by one by one. So I really walked away not feeling like I can trust the future of relationships. Yep. And I still run into it like literally today. Yeah.
Yep.
Well, welcome. Welcome.
Yes. Hi. I try to explain this to people too, where I'm like, I didn't really have a model of a relationship that was healthy, that stayed together, that I respect, you know? And so at that point, it's kind of hard to imagine out. And I don't know. I believe in relationship anarchy. Have you heard of this?
Only mildly, but you can educate me on it.
Sure, okay.
Please.
Well, I love your friend's quote, or the little R, and that we're always in relationship. A lot of what relationship anarchy says is to, you know, let's start from scratch. You're in all these different relationships. One is not more important than the other. You know, you give that meaning. And so, like, how do we craft relationships freely, not saying our sexual relationships are somehow more important than our platonic relationships per se? And so for me, and what I hope to do as a future clinician and like trajectory towards this, you know, path is like, how do we create relationships that aren't necessarily in this binary of monogamous or poly, but rather a created relationship of your choosing, of the partners that come together, and how can we make both people feel safe and constantly have that evolution of checking in with one another, so that in theory we could maybe prevent, you know, all of these long marriage divorce, you know, and that doesn't protect the relationship as a whole, but maybe that relationship will take on different, you know, facets. Maybe if you go from sexual to platonic and still stay in each other's lives in some way, you know, with that level of communication, I think it would be more possible than what we currently have as our paradigms for relationships.
Yeah. Well, and that's talking about the, indoctrination, especially around relationships in general.
Yeah.
That was a huge, I'll just say this, but it's kind of hilarious. I won't name the individual, but I was talking to an elder that I was like working on like an open relationship dynamic and talking about how that stuff looks, and it's something that I'm still working through in terms of my own comfortability. It's hard to do with like hard abandonment issues. Let me tell you that.
Yes, I can imagine. You are, yes, that's a whole road.
Yeah. So, but it was really interesting because I basically just kind of said that. I didn't even go into it. Oh, we've talked about open dynamics. And this person goes, all of that open relationship stuff is like, you know, a bunch of BS, or it doesn't work, or it doesn't something. But ironically, this marriage or this circumstance had ended in divorce from affairs and all of these other things with this. And I was like, you were in an open relationship.
Exactly, you just didn't consent to it.
You didn't. I was like, you didn't call it that. And maybe everybody didn't know, but that's actually what you were doing.
I know. Isn't that insane?
It's like, it's just a non-communicative one. And or people are just pretending that this doesn't happen. Like, I was just looking at stats about that within relationships or like marriages and stuff, where it's like, I don't know slight to anybody who's figured it out and has the monogamous relationship and it's working. All good. But the numbers is like, most monogamous relationships are not monogamous relationships.
Yes.
It's just not tallying up, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, and again, it's not to say that it can't be done or that there aren't variations, but
sure.
Like, I've more so just been investigating how just the different ways that you can have relationship with people, and that it doesn't have to be like this cut and dry method that's really just rooted in a bunch of random like power dynamic religious stuff. And there's no like, whatever you believe, I'm all for, but the legality of what we've done with marriage is just this like entity that we've put forward in this presentation and way of living life that is supposed to be perfect. And I'm like, it really doesn't. I don't know, guys.
Isn't that crazy? I completely agree with you. I mean, the concept of romanticism as like an idea, an ideology, really didn't start until the 1750s in Europe. Is pretty the art that was coming out of that time was starting to do very poetical stuff, very like, oh, you know, lords, ladies, all this sort of stuff that you're seeing. And eventually I feel like we have just combined the concept of marriage, which started as a property dynamic. I'm sure you're aware of this. Most people are aware of this, as a way to, you know, own your wife. To be very clear, I think people forget marriage was the ownership of your wife as property.
Yeah, and passing family name and all that.
Yes, yes. And as romanticism and those two ideas started to come together, and people used to have kids, you know, have sex and have kids. I mean, I'm sure it was for pleasure too, right? But like primarily because you lived on a farm where you needed to have enough children to like survive in that dynamic.
Yeah.
So then as we start to not have, you know, kids for just surviving your farm and for love, and you're building these romantic relationships, people start having less kids that we've seen over the years. And now it's really just become, oh yeah, marriage is for love and authentic expression. And but along with all of that baggage of that history is that we're keeping like marriage is supposed to be with one person forever. You're supposed to have enjoyable sex with them forever and the rest of your life and never want anyone else. And if you do it all, that means you didn't love them in the first place.
Yeah.
And just like all these other slews that were never attached to marriage to start, but we as a society have pushed them together. And like I was reading, you might really like Alan de Bottom, I believe is his name. He's a philosopher. He talks about the post-romantic era. You actually probably love this. So yeah, he talks about how like maybe we can move towards more communication and finding ways to be in a relationship where we want to stay together rather than just separate because of stuff like this. And he is a philosopher that also started the School of Life that strongly talks about like relationships are something that you can learn to be in and you learn how to love, and that he actually puts out a school teaching these sorts of things. I'm just like, wow. I know. I'm like, what a dream one day if I could get him on the podcast. He's got videos on YouTube that I just binge uncontrollably because they're like these 5-minute little clips about various aspects of life and living in relationship that are pretty profound in my opinion.
Yeah.
You'd love it.
Yeah, no, that's and honestly, well, I'm reading for the second time the Ethical Slut, which is
I love that one. Oh my god!
And there's a few, but the other thing about it too is I've been working on within myself. It does. I mean, it makes you challenge and face a lot of your own stuff because I have issues with open things around safety and security for me personally, and what I can actually deal with or tolerate, and it may change from healing with a lot of things. But I think for me personally, I've also been like. You've been in a pretty heightened state of evaluating all this childhood stuff. I think there's just so much in there with me that I'm like taking that part slow as well too. Yeah. If I don't care about anybody, like if there's no desire to attach, I can be. It's ethically non-monogamous, extremely easy, no issue. But as soon as there's like more emotional attachment for me, it's difficult. I'll just say that.
Yeah, it hits differently. Yeah, my first poly relationship was not a stable partner, and it was much easier to conceptualize them going out and around. And like as I've gone into other relationships and tried to do the same things, it does change. The more you develop that deeper attachment, it suddenly, and this kind of makes sense, right? It gets scarier. The more attached you get, the more worried that you're going to leave and they're just going to disappear. Yeah. It's so hard. And I mean, at least for me too, I've had a lot of trauma with men. So like learning to like let go and be vulnerable in that and surrender and trust. And then you form this deep attachment where then, the thought of them leaving just starts to spark different things in you that can be hard to process and sit with. But at least for me and where I'm currently at, and this is obviously always changing, I think love is abundant, but I don't think time and energy are, right? If you want a relation, and I think I do potentially want kids in some point in my future, way after I'm done with this doctoral thing I'm doing and all of this. But I think like having that sort of life where I could have a very deep partner that I go through life with sounds like a beautiful idea. And I would love to have that freedom to create that with that person where I do know that they're a primary person I come home to. but also have the
Yeah.
ability to live freely out with other people. And so, like, how do you create conditions of safety so that you both
Yeah.
feel like that time and energy is being devoted to the other person, but they also have the liberty to go and be an independent human and explore the world, whether that includes sex or not. It doesn't have to for them. It could just be deep emotional connections, you know? I don't know. It's really hard, but that's kind of like what I dream of, because I don't think that we could be monogamous and happy with just one person for the rest of our life. I don't.
Well,
I wish I did.
Well, so that's even with the ethical slut. Like, one of the things I like is they talk about all types of things. They talk about, you know, like play parties. We're taking a turn from where we started with this.
No, I'm with you.
But, you know, they talk about, like, you know, play parties, like, you know, there's partner swap kind of things. There's all types of, like, and just saying that it's been an interesting book to hear, like, or even it's like one thing where they were like, oh, there's a couple that's been together for whatever time, and they have this like once a month you know, time that they go see a buddy or blah blah blah, and then go back. So and again, I'm still trying to figure out my place within it all, but it's more so just fascinating to hear and to just understand that there are different ways that people are in relationship. And more importantly than even any of that kind of stuff, honestly, like way more importantly than that, is just that the level and ability to communicate about desires, feelings, insecurities. One of the most difficult things and I don't want to speak for men everywhere, but what I will say is probably one of the least conventional male narrative things to do is to admit to and be vulnerable around an insecurity. I don't know I'm sure it does happen, and I'm also kind of a hermit in plenty of ways, so I don't want to say that I don't see it, but that it is a few and far between that I think I've ever really seen too many men like come forward and say, hey, oh, you know what, actually I feel, you know, insecure because, you know, this guy is 6'3" and I'm 5'10", and you know, I don't like that you like this person, or I feel like whatever the insecurity is, like if it like it's so there's this like idea of, oh, you just need to either like power through that in some kind of way, or like you need to over manly whatever the insecurity is, instead of just being like, oh, you know what, man, this doesn't happen. But I don't know why I just thought of the example of like, I grow a lot of back hair, so I don't want to jump into a pool. I don't grow a lot of back hair. Okay. All right, I'm just gonna say it.
Got it.
Like it's clear.
I see. You're good.
but no, just saying, like, if it's a thing of like, blah blah blah. So I feel insecure at a pool. Like, just that level of communication of this is something that I'm struggling with, and that's been in relationship one of the most difficult things that I've had to do. But I've also been fortunate enough in, you know, some cases to have like partners like, who can actually show up with kindness or with nurturing. Like I'll just say my most recent partner, like in a more serious sense, like I had never really been greeted. Actually, I can't even say that. I'm sure plenty of women tried to greet me with it.
I love this correction already.
I was never in the space that I talked about something like that or have vulnerability expressed and then greeted with, you know, oh, that's actually like, I'm sorry that you feel like that. Like, oh, like, what do you need? Do you want a hug? And I was like, what is this? What is this source? This sorcery. Yeah, but that's been just amazing in terms of learning about relationship like that. Yeah. And
how did you respond to that when they offered that love to you?
That's been a running battle. A little better, I think. Back to the point of just me not trying to overly downplay things, is that like it's kind of shitty and kind of sad in some ways, but it's just not really how I was responded to in most cases. Like, I was shut down a lot, or the best description I would say is there's just a lot of things. There's like a lot of surface level warmth, but when it came down to emotional, relational things, just a lot more coldness. It's getting better, the space that I'm in now in terms of speaking to family or other friends. So I've been working on slowing myself down enough to try to respond to even that type of response differently, and like, get out of this. I have to try to fight this person who's trying to be close to me and be like, oh, okay, that actually is a show that this is a safe environment, or this is a caring person, or this is secure, and let go into it. But it's honestly really, really hard. It's really hard.
Of course, because I mean, just as you said, let go, right? That even that language, I'm thinking of, letting go and falling is what you're doing. You're surrendering into the love of another person and fully embracing the fact that you are connected and interdependent on them.
Yeah.
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 Ugh, I know, right? Oh, interdependence. Oh,
as you say it. Terrifying.
I know, but it's well, maybe let me ask you, how has it felt to continue to lean into it?
I would say it depends on the day. If I'm being really, really honest, sometimes it can be disorienting. If I'm being like really, really honest, it can actually be kind of disorienting, because I'm still working on the actual trusting of that. So sometimes it's like really great and it's wonderful and it's like, okay, everything feels secure. But an issue that I've realized with myself is, if that gets thrown off a bit, like with the person, if there's something that that rattles the sense of safety and security, myself is trying to like, retreat into all of these old ways. And it takes like, so it's been overall good, because in a way it's like I can see the light, and kind of thing, but then definitely challenging, to be real, and that might get easier over time. It's just
or not
the space I've been in.
Yeah.
You're like, or not.
I don't know, my therapist always says that to me. Like, I'm like, oh, am I gonna be cured of my anxiety? She's like, no, probably not. And I'm like, there's some sort of beauty, I think, in that, of recognizing that, like, yeah, these are my triggers, and like I recognize them. I do think it gets easier. I do really do. But I like to be.
I hope so.
I know. I like to be a little bit pessimistic at times, because I think some sort of pessimism allows for more reality, right? Like, I think probably the real closest thing to an answer would be that it will come out of nowhere at times. At least, in terms of my own trauma of like, I was sexually assaulted, and so that is something that I've been processing for so long, and so there's so many times where I'm like, yeah, I've processed this so many times, and this is so good. I've already checked this all off, and I'm very conscious of it now. And then just something, and then all of a sudden you're in that space, and you're like, how did I get here? Why are all these things starting to come up? Why are these thoughts running through my head? And it's been such a process even for me through that, of like having compassion for myself when it comes up after feeling like I've already processed this enough that it should be done. Yeah.
It's real, yeah. And thank you for sharing that, by the way. And sorry to hear that. But that's definitely, I can really resonate with that. Like, it's that feeling. What did I say to like one of my buddies? I was like, oh yeah, doing a bunch of therapy, I got into this mentality of being like, oh, I recognize that. I see that pathway. I'm like, got it. And then I'm like, oh, no. This is the start.
Yep. You're like, no.
This is actually just the beginning, that you are aware of it more. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And then I feel like after that, the active choice, I feel like so much. And one of the things I'm leaning into as I study more and more psychology is this concept that we choose how we want to show up in this world. So when you have that moment of pause in between, we're feeling activated, if we can stop ourselves just enough to take a breath and decide then from there how we want to proceed, like we can interrupt that pattern and that change. And so like for me, that's trusting the person before me and surrendering, again, being vulnerable and expressing when I feel these things and all of that sort of stuff, I do think it gets better.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I hope so.
Yeah, exactly. We hope so.
I'm like, this is trash.
But I mean, like, the real human experience is that we have this, and then, life is full of traumas, and we'll get a new trauma from something different, unfortunately, and then have to go through the same process. I mean, I wish life was smooth. I one of my favorite metaphors is, like thinking about life as oceans. The ocean is so powerful. We'll have these massive waves and other things, but, you also can surf in it, right? Like, you can learn how to ride with more and more practice, these various waves of life, and they're not going to stop for certain, but we might get more experienced about how to go through this process.
Yeah. No, I think you're spot on about that. And that's been a trickier thing to realize for me, is like how to really and it's I've been trying to back myself away from the idea. Probably the way that I was doing before was like, I'm just gonna speedboat through this
I love that analogy.
I'm like, we're just gonna cut through this thing, but it's like, actually, you're just gonna like blow up this engine and probably sink way worse than what you did. Like,
Jesus, yeah.
So I agree. Like, that part of just really learning how to ride the wave is like, that's like the jewel.
Yeah. Or so I hope. We'll check in later and see how we feel about life.
I'm like, let me know as
I know.
you figure it out. You seem like you got a pretty good grasp on it.
You think so?
Maybe.
I like to think I do. I don't know. I think that in the recognition of my own failure has allowed me to maybe get a better grasp. I mean, like, for me, I was Christian, and I was condemning homosexuals wearing a purity ring. And then
you were full-fledged. You had it
all.
all.
Yeah. So then I come out as queer. I get pregnant, have an abortion. I'm, assaulted, going through all this trauma, all these other things, and now trying to come into a relationship anarchy space. So, like, at this point, I've pretty much done a 180 and everything, and so I still like to leave enough room that I could do a 180 back at any point, because I was just as wrong then, and what if I'm just as wrong now? And I don't know.
It's a little harder for me to see you go back. No offense to any Christians. No offense to any Christians. Just based on the conversation today, I think it would be, I don't know.
Crazy.
Religions are also evolving, I think, in times, too. This has nothing to do with anything, but I've been watching a bunch of stuff on Scientology.
Oh, God.
This whole past week.
Wild.
And I'm just like, again, no slight to anybody, but it's fascinating to see that. I think that I'll say this. I think that human belief is also evolving over time. I don't know what it will look like. Because there are things that are being accepted within churches now that literally never were at other periods too. So, and I'm not religious at all, really, but that's definitely
For sure. And I mean, you talked about the internet earlier, and I think that would also explain a lot of this. Can you imagine growing up before the internet, where what your source of knowledge was your community? And so, you might have learned in a book in a library somewhere that another religion does something else, but that's about all you knew. Nowadays with the internet, you connect to anyone across the world practicing any religion, see their shitty comments on Facebook or whatever you were talking about earlier, and just even have that thought of, wow, there's other people out there, actual real human beings that believe this stuff. And I think that changes your perspective as you become more and more globalized, I guess would be the right word.
Yeah. And I still don't know how we're responding to that. I always try to point out the fact that, like, this is, there has never been this much information presented to humans, ever in history. I think it's really easy to get comfortable with this idea that we are, I'll say, ready, but also like that this is abnormal for the human experience. Like, the point in history that we are in, specifically now with the boom of the internet and how connected we are, this is abnormal for the entirety of human history. So that's something that I work on trying to take less or try to take more serious, and then also provide myself some lightness from it, because it's like, maybe we all feel super anxious and have all this other stuff going on because we're getting hit with way too much input, and humans have never been hit with this much input about anything.
I agree. Yep. And then you get this pressure, should I know about all of the pain in the world? Am I, a caring person if I don't research all these different problems and be aware of all of it? But the problem is that the suffering of the earth is pretty massive. And yeah, does it serve us to be constantly thinking about all these things? I don't know. And I do think, like something like the internet is massively going to change how we look at relationships. It's no longer just your grandparents living in their house with one another for the rest of their lives. We now have so much interconnection. That is massively different. And so to expect it to also change relationships, I think is a very valid thought.
Yeah. Well, and honestly, like back in the day too, around relationships in general, it was like, I'm not talking to this person anymore. We broke up. And then
never saw
that was it. You didn't call them anymore.
Right. Right.
There wasn't like, now it's like, I'm gonna go stalk their IG.
Or their LinkedIn, if they don't have IG. Not talking from personal experience.
I was like speaking from experience.
Yeah, just one person. But yeah, and I mean, back then, like couples, mental health, if we talk about mental health now being barely talked about, just imagine back then, right? So if what you're talking about with all these different expectations of holding it in, all this stuff,
yeah.
Couples were not communicating about the problems that they had to this degree, and divorce was not a normalized thing within society. And so I'm optimistic that there was some very true love there, but at the same time, realistic that I think a lot of people stay in marriages for duty. And we see that totally. In the happiness statistics about marriage, unfortunately.
Yeah, totally.
But I want marriages to work in general. I just think that, marriages don't have to be monogamous.
Yeah, and that's super socialized.
Yeah.
I'm breaking it down for myself too, because I don't know if I ever had those visions. I didn't really have the like, we're gonna have this house with a fence and
yeah,
the dog and the cat and the whatever kids and blah blah blah.
Yeah.
I think mine got a little skewed
somewhere along the way. Sure. Yeah, I think society is definitely changed, and it will be one hell of an experiment to see where our society, our generation who has grown up with the internet, will be. I think we're going to change a lot. This will be a huge thing, probably, I imagine, when people look back.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you have anything before we sat down today that going into the podcast, you were like, I really want to talk about this on this space that maybe we didn't touch?
I think we got to a lot of it, to be honest. I feel like I just kind of poured out. I probably just rambled endlessly today.
No, I love everything that you've shared. I'm just so, in awe of your connection to yourself and your ability to be vulnerable and to show up in this space and talk about your experience and all the work that you're doing with people in the community. It's very admirable, and yeah.
Well, thank you. It has been a journey. But I would say, we got to a lot of it. I think, of course, I just have to give a shout out to Nexus for making, or Jayla. I don't know which was it the regular name or was it the superhero name?
I think she said Nexus J for hers, okay. But yeah, but Jayla, I know, yeah.
But yeah, I think I appreciate the space and conversations that are just kind of open like this in general. So thanks for having me on, and shout out to the homie and to the band Brizzy Danks, all them good people.
Yeah, I could definitely see why she would think that we'd get along with this level of conversation. One of the things I do ask everybody as a closing question on the podcast, and I know we talked about so many different things already, but what is one thing that you wish other people knew was more normal?
I wish that more people knew that having insecurities and not just trying to quiet the fact that they exist by putting things in their place to convince yourself, or training your mentality to think that they're not there, or, telling yourself a story that has crushed it. And I'm not saying that you need to succumb to the thoughts centered around insecurities, but in like the true sense of the word, that there are things or moments that you will not feel secure within yourself or within relationships or within your place within society, and just being okay with trying to explore that in a way that's more healthy, and just acknowledging that we're human, and in particular through the lens of guys, that you're not gonna tough your way out of that even if you pretend it's not there.
Right. I love that. Yeah, that reality that insecurity happens. And there's I mean in general there's a million things to be insecure about in life. I mean, our existence is insecure. I can't promise that I'll be here in a year, right? Like, there's so many things. I think one of the real realities of the human existence is that so much is up to change and flux. And so how can we get more comfortable with these moments of insecurity and move through them and grow through them rather than staying stuck in them and then becoming rigid?
Yeah, definitely.
Well, yeah, it was such a pleasure to have you and to just feel your full presence here and your authenticity. It's been very apparent, and it's been just so nice to connect with you.
Yeah, thanks for the chat as well. It was pretty on time for me today. I've been in existential crisis all day, so this is right on time.
Yeah, I mean, I could probably existential crisis with you for hours.
Indeed.
If you enjoyed today's episode, then leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen to your podcast. And if you're a part of the Anarchist community, then follow us on Instagram or nominate a guest for the show by sending in a letter to modernanarchypodcast@gmail.com. Otherwise, I'll see you next week.